Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Silva. Thank you for joining me for this quick talk on a very important clinical pearl that I want to share, especially with you students and providers in training out there. I wasn't taught this, and I've never seen it talked about, but it is 100% true in 100% of clinical situations. And I can't think of anything else that comes close to the conclusiveness of this in mental health. And so you guys should really know about it. It concerns generalized anxiety disorder and/or panic disorder and/or OCD, social anxiety, etc., other forms of endogenous, i.e. innate, genetic, inherited forms of anxiety. Syndromes that I collectively term major anxiety syndrome. That's not in the DSM, but these syndromes, which are probably different conditions in different people, but when they show up in combination with one another in any given individual, it's the same illness, in my opinion. That's just the most elegant assumption. At any rate, they are the most genetically transmitted conditions in all of psychiatry. I've been practicing for almost 30 years, and I can tell you categorically they are the most reliably inherited conditions, even more than bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. It never skips a generation. When I make a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder, I know that either mom or dad, or sometimes both, suffer from some combination of the aforementioned conditions. Always. I don't ask if, I ask which one. And if the diagnosis is correct, and that's a big if, you'll find it to be true every time. Usually patients don't hesitate when I give them that choice. They're able to tell me, sometimes with a moment of reflection, even if they're considering it for the first time. If they deny it, and they give me some pretty solid evidence against it, then the diagnosis is wrong. Period. A person always inherits, and they always get it from a parent. It never skips a generation. Now, sometimes the condition isn't obvious to the patient because, for example, while mom was outgoing and outspoken and quick to anger and never shied away from conflict and demonstrated no worry or avoidant or obsessive-compulsive behaviors whatsoever, dad was a bad alcoholic who never got sober. In that scenario, I presume he was self-medicating. And so the anxiety that would have been demonstrated was masked by another disorder. That's a pretty common scenario when we just don't see it in either parent. But dad was drinking all the time. He was on medication all the time. Not medication, he was on alcohol, that was his medication. But it's like he was on Xanax or Valium all the time. Well, so no, she didn't see him panicking or constantly verbalizing worry, but he had this other condition that was pretty bad. Or sometimes we have an absent parent or a distant parent following a divorce, for example. So no, she doesn't really see it in either mom or dad, but how close is she really to dad? Not very close at all. And so a parent, if it's not severe, they can occlude. Even if they go get treatment, they can have their diagnosis not be evident to their children. And especially since we tend to rationalize our emotions, and we especially tend to rationalize anxiety. Well, I'm anxious because of, and then we point to our triggers, what's actually triggering our anxiety, that wouldn't trigger a panic attack in another person, or that another person without this condition wouldn't be obsessing about all night long and unable to sleep. So it's really not the stressor, it's our response to the stressor. But we rationalize it in our own minds, and a lot of times don't go get treatment, and we just don't consider it a condition. And a lot of times patients don't consider it a condition in themselves because, again, it's lifelong, and they've been rationalizing it, pointing out their stressors their whole lives. And they don't see that they're overreacting, because if it's not super bad, if they're not having panic attacks, or if they don't have severe OCD, for example, where it's disruptive to their life, or severe social anxiety, where they have no friends, if it's not severe, if it's mild or moderate, a patient can go their whole lives and not even know that they have this condition, because for them it's normal. For them it's just life. So it's easy not to see it, but it's always there. If the diagnosis is correct, it is always, always there in a parent. But the symptoms can be sometimes not super obvious. I had a patient the other day in whom I suspected generalized anxiety disorder. It was pretty obvious to me after I'd gotten to know her for a while. It wasn't her chief complaint. I was treating her for something else. But I noticed that she tended to always be talking about the worst case scenario. There was a lot of anticipatory anxiety, and she demonstrated a need to control outcomes, in particular with her children. You see that a lot in a mother that has generalized anxiety. Her number one concern above all else is her children. She's a good mom. She worries about her kids, but the worry is excessive. And if the kid doesn't call her, then she's worried until she gets that call. She doesn't know that her child is okay. Even though it's just a regular day like any other day, the child went to work and maybe the mom had a dream or something. And so she calls and says, hey, I'm concerned about this and please call me back. And until she gets that call, there's a part of her mind that thinks something could be wrong. And that's not normal. And that's an obsession, however severe it is. And so anyway, I had this mom who had a special needs child, an adult child, and I noticed things that really hinted at generalized anxiety disorder. And so I explored it with the patient, and I was pretty sure the patient had it. And so the next question that I ask in order to help me confirm the diagnosis is, how about your mom? How about your dad? It may be easier for her to see that mom was worried all the time or that dad had panic attacks. And so then we can clinch the diagnosis. Patient, if I can get one or the other parent that has it, and I'm pretty sure the patient has it, that for me clinches the diagnosis. And the patient also acknowledged being a nervous kid. These conditions are 100% genetic, and they show up in childhood, which, apart from childhood conditions like autism and ADHD, is rare. Most psychiatric syndromes show up in early adulthood and later life. But generalized anxiety disorder is the only disorder that's not specifically a disorder of development that shows up in childhood. It's not only genetic, but it's there from a very, very early age. And so in addition to having an affected parent from whom they inherited this anxiety spectrum condition, they themselves were cautious, avoidant, obsessive, shy, easily overwhelmed, etc. as children, from as early as they can reliably remember. Because what they're recalling is their temperament. And that's present even earlier, during years they scarcely remember, and which they're not able to tell you about. The symptoms typically wax and wane, especially OCD, which many individuals with these syndromes outgrow. And a lot of times, patients only endorse symptoms in adolescence because that's what they most vividly remember. That's when it really got bad. And who remembers that much about their early childhoods anyway? But in fact, it starts early. Really from the cradle. These babies are not placid babies. They're colicky, they cry a lot, they don't sleep well, some of them. Studies have shown that children with a history of colic had higher levels of anxiety and depression later in life. The temperament is also determined by genes, and it's immutable. Why wouldn't we see symptoms in infancy? The ability to self-soothe is presumably impaired in these babies. Anyway, I have OCD, and I clearly got it from my mom, and I was a colicky baby, according to my parents. And I was also a nervous little kid. My teachers noticed it. My fourth grade teacher called me a worrywart one time. She was looking at our handwriting exercises, because in those days, prehistoric times, we were still learning how to write in cursive. I don't know if kids still learn to write in cursive, but she was looking at my practice, and she wanted me to go up to the chalkboard and to write out a capital cursive T. She wasn't happy with the way I did that. And I must have had 20 questions for her. I remember this. And before I would do it, I asked her a question, and then she just do your best. And then another question. I don't remember what my questions were. I must have asked her 3. And after the third question or the fourth question, she was like, "You're a worrywart." And I was like, and then I was taken aback and worried that she called me a worrywart. Now she gave me something else to worry about. And I remember having OCD. Anyway, a lot of times you see in these individuals, a lot of times you see OCD, but then as the brain develops in adolescence, the brain continues to develop into your early 20s. A lot of people will remember, and they will tell me, OCD, I mean, no doubt about it, OCD, rituals, ritualistic behavior, counting, repeating themselves, going out of their way, doing weird stuff, and then it went away. But then some patients obviously continue to have it into adulthood, like yours truly. But my condition is mild. But this is why I had some added insight into it, and then I explored it with my patients, and I found that 100% of the time you're going to see it in one of the parents, which is really the take-home message from this video. But anyway, back to my recent patient. Initially, she categorically denied a family history of generalized anxiety disorder. Here I am, suspecting it in her. I've been treating her for a while. I see these tendencies, right, that are red flags. I ask her, yeah, she was a nervous kid. And then I ask her, well, what about anyone in your family? And what about mom and dad? And she denied it. But then I asked again because I was pretty sure. And I asked a little bit more carefully and closed-endedly. I told her it must be in your mom and your daddy. Sure, you didn't see your mom wasn't a worrier? I specifically said, because a lot of times it comes from, I don't know if it comes more from moms or, not, as I think about it, just in my own anecdotal experience, I don't know that the prevalence of generalized anxiety disorder is greater in women. And I think it is a little bit greater in women. I will add a caption here. But in my experience, it's usually mom. It's usually mom. So I asked her, you're sure that mom wasn't a worrier? And she reflected a bit, and then she rationalized, as all people do, especially anxious types. She rationalized that her mother became a worrier and a catastrophizer after the death of her husband, which is wrong because grief is never an etiology for generalized anxiety disorder. If her mom had that, she had it genetically. It's not anything that grief would cause. Complicated bereavement can sometimes induce a major depressive episode, but usually in patients that are already vulnerable to major depressive disorder, even if they've never had an episode before. So grief can trigger MDD in a person that has MDD. However, it's not going to cause generalized anxiety disorder or panic disorder or social anxiety. That just doesn't happen. And so I asked her, when did that happen? When did her father die? And she told me she was 7 or 8. So basically, all of the patient's life that she can reliably remember, her mother demonstrated signs of an anxiety disorder, consistent with generalized anxiety disorder. But the patient incorrectly rationalized it and attributed it to her father's death. So there again, you can have a patient deny a family history when it's actually present. And so if you are pretty good at diagnosing generalized anxiety disorder from what the patient is telling you, and then you want to confirm it by nailing it, by saying mom or dad, and having the patient say, yes, it was mom, that was a big worrier, and you don't have to think about it anymore. You don't have to wonder about it anymore, especially if the case is kind of a mild case of generalized anxiety disorder, and there's a huge stressor, and the patient did fine, no complaints of childhood anxiety even. They just don't see it in themselves. They see it as normal. They're rationalizing it to their triggers and external stressors. And so, no, negative. And now they're having panic attacks in their late 20s, early 30s because they're under a huge amount of stress and they're not sleeping very well. And sure, those were double and triple whammies that unmasked a more severe manifestation of a lifelong condition that they've had all their lives. And so you're trying to tease that out, and the patient's not really being very helpful. They're being honest, and they're sincerely answering your questions to the best of their ability, but you think they have GAD. So you want to nail it, and you want to ask. Then you ask that question. And sometimes even then, the patient is not very helpful. They're just not a good historian. They're being honest, but they start rationalizing. They answer you like my patient did, which her mom had it her whole life. Oh, but it was after dad died. Why? Because the patient really saw her decompensate and really remembers mom grieving her dad's death for many, many months. It took her a couple of years to recover, maybe longer than the 2 years that it takes most people. And so that's what she vividly remembers. Oh, your father, your father's not here. And so the patient rationalized that. So yes, this patient has generalized anxiety disorder. Yes, she inherited from her mother. And so you astute clinicians out there, remember this pearl. It will serve you well in diagnosing your patients with these syndromes that are 100% genetic. And how they express themselves, that depends on the environment for sure. There's always a nature-nurture balance, but the scales are heavily, heavily tilted in terms of nature in these conditions. So that's all I want to say. Thank you for listening, and comments are always welcome.